Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time we're taking a look at something we all use every day, whether we realize it or not, and that's probability. We see it in weather forecasts, sports, all sorts of things. But what if I told you that this idea of probability, that it might not actually exist?
Yeah, it's a really interesting concept. We often think of probability like it's this objective truth, like there's a fixed number that tells us how likely something is. But as we get into it today, I think you'll see it's a lot more complicated and even subjective than it first appears.
Yeah, and helping us navigate this tricky topic is David Spiegelhalter, who's a professor of statistics. And he actually argues that probability might not exist in the way that we often think. So I was reading his article, and it really got me thinking about how we use and interpret probabilities.
Yeah, he makes a really good case. Let's start with a simple example that I think everyone's familiar with, like flipping a coin. Most people would say it's a 50-50 chance, right? Heads or tails.
Right.
But, if you think about it more deeply, how do we actually measure that? Like, how do we know that probability is true? When you flip the coin, it either lands on heads or it lands on tails. There's no in between.
Yeah, it's one or the other. So where does that leave the concept of probability?
Well, that's where it gets a little bit tricky. Spiegelhalter points out that probability has these two kind of faces to it.
Yeah.
There's chance, which are the things that we can't know for sure beforehand, and then there's ignorance, which are the things that we just don't know yet.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see what you mean. So it's like probability isn't just about the actual event itself, but it's also about what we as observers know or don't know about it.
Exactly. He says almost every practical use of probability involves a bit of both chance and some degree of ignorance.
So even in something as simple as a coin flip, you're saying there's some element of subjectivity involved, because we might not know everything about the coin or how it's being flipped.
That's exactly right. Even with a simple coin flip, we're making a bunch of assumptions. We assume the coin is fair, that it's being flipped properly, and that there's no other weird stuff going on, affecting the outcome. But in the real world, you can never be 100% certain about any of those things.
Our understanding of probability is kind of limited by what we know.
Right.
So it's not this pure objective truth, is it?
Not really, no. And Spiegelhalter, he uses this really striking example to illustrate this point. He talks about the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty serious example. What does that have to do with probability?
Well, at the time, the military leaders, they assessed that the mission had what they called a fair chance of success.
A fair chance. That sounds, fairly optimistic.
You'd think so, right? But get this, when they actually tried to put a number on it, what they really meant was that there was a 70% chance of failure.
Wow, that is a huge difference. So even when people use seemingly positive words to describe probabilities, the actual numbers might tell a very different story.
That's a great point. And it shows how subjective interpretations and even the language that we use can really influence how we perceive and use probabilities.
Right, so this isn't just some abstract philosophical debate.
Yeah.
This subjectivity, it can have very real consequences.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've established that probability might not be as objective as we often think it is. But where does this leave us when we start talking about science? I mean, science is supposed to be all about objective truth, right?
Yeah, good question. That's where it gets even more interesting, because in science, we rely a lot on probabilities and statistics to, try to find those objective truths.
So are you saying that even scientific studies, which are supposed to be so rigorous and controlled, can't completely escape this element of subjectivity?
Well, let's look at an example. Spiegelhalter talks about the COVID-19 dexamethasone trial in his article.
Oh, yeah, I remember hearing about that. It's a pretty big deal, right?
Yeah, it was. This trial showed that dexamethasone, it could actually significantly reduce the mortality risk for patients who were on ventilators.
So it ended up being a really important finding for treating COVID patients.
Absolutely. It had a huge impact. But even in a study like this, where they're trying to be super precise, the probabilities they calculated, they were still based on certain assumptions.
Like what? What kinds of assumptions?
Well, for example, they assumed that all the patients in each group, they had the same underlying chance of surviving for 28 days.
Okay, but isn't that how you're supposed to do a clinical trial? I mean, you're trying to isolate variables, right?
Right. But in the real world, it's just not that simple. Individual risks, they vary so much depending on a person's age, their health, all sorts of other factors.
So you're saying that even in a controlled environment like a clinical trial, there's still this layer of subjectivity that kind of seeps into the probabilities they come up with.
Yeah, that's the idea. And that's where Spiegelhalter brings in this quote. He says, All models are wrong, but some are useful.
All models are wrong. It's a pretty bold statement.
It is, but think about it. The dexamethasone study, even though it had these limitations and assumptions, it was still incredibly useful, right? It gave doctors this crucial evidence that ultimately led to, saving lives.
So it's not about dismissing the results of these studies, but more about understanding that there are always going to be some limitations and assumptions built into them.
Right. It's about being a more critical thinker when we encounter probabilities, even in a scientific setting.
Okay, so that makes sense. But then this leads to an even bigger question. Does some kind of objective probability actually exist out there? Independent of all these human attempts to measure it.
Yes, that's the million-dollar question. There have been tons of attempts to try to define this elusive objective probability. One idea is what's called frequentist probability.
Frequentist probability. Okay, tell me more about that.
So imagine flipping a coin, but you flip it an infinite number of times. The true probability of getting heads, according to this view, it would be the proportion of times it lands on heads in that infinite series of flips.
I mean, I get the concept, but flipping a coin an infinite number of times, that's not exactly practical, is it?
No, not at all. It's a totally theoretical concept, and that's one of the problems with frequentist probability. It kind of works in these idealized scenarios, but in the real world, we never have infinite data.
Right. It just doesn't really translate to everyday life. So are there any other ways people have tried to pin down this objective probability?
Another idea is called propensity. This one suggests that there's an inherent tendency for certain things to happen in a certain way.
Okay, so for example, if someone has a family history of heart disease, you might say they have a propensity for developing it too, right?
Exactly. But here's the catch. How do we measure this propensity? It seems like we're just giving a name to something that we can't actually observe or quantify directly.
So it's like another one of those slippery concepts. We try to grasp it, but it just kind of, slips away.
Yeah, pretty much. It seems like every time we get close to pinning down this true probability, it just moves further out of reach.
Are there any situations where it might make sense to talk about objective probability? Like where it's more than just a concept?
Well, there are a few cases where it feels a little more tangible. Think about really controlled systems like roulette wheels or dice.
Okay, I can see that.
In those cases, the patterns are more predictable, and you can calculate probabilities that seem closer to what we might think of as objective, at least in that context.
So it's like in those specific scenarios, there's a little more truth to the probability, maybe.
Maybe, but even then, you can never completely eliminate assumptions. What if the roulette wheel has a tiny, tiny imperfection that you can't even see? It could still throw off the results, even if it seems totally random.
It feels like we're constantly chasing this idea of objective probability,
Yeah.
but it always remains just out of reach. Is this all just a big illusion?
Well, there's this famous mathematician and philosopher named Bruno de Finetti, and he actually said flat out, probability does not exist.
Whoa, hold on, wait a minute. So are we saying probability is just made up? Should we just throw it all out the window?
Not necessarily. It's more nuanced than that. You see, even though de Finetti said probability doesn't exist, he also said that we should often act as if it does.
Okay, now that just sounds like a contradiction. How can you act as if something exists when it doesn't?
It all comes down to this idea of exchangeability. Basically, we tend to treat events as if they're independent and have this underlying probability, even if that probability is all in our heads. Like if we flip a coin 10 times and it lands on heads every single time.
You're still going to think there's a 50-50 chance it'll land on heads again on the next flip, right?
Exactly. It's like we assume there's this hidden force controlling it, even though it might just be our brains trying to find patterns.
It's like our need for order makes us see patterns and probabilities where they might not actually exist.
Yeah, there's definitely something to that. And Spiegelhalter sums this up perfectly when he says, probability probably does not exist, but it is often useful to act as if it does.
I love that. It's like it acknowledges the mystery, the philosophical side of probability, but it also recognizes that it's still a useful tool in our lives.
Right. The key takeaway here is that probability is more complex and slippery than we often realize. It's not about finding a definite answer to this question of whether it truly exists or not. It's about recognizing its subjective nature and using it as a tool with awareness.
So how do we apply this to our everyday lives? We started off talking about weather forecasts and all that. Now that we've gone down this philosophical rabbit hole, how does it change how we should think about those everyday probabilities?
It means we shouldn't just take probabilities at face value.
Yeah.
We see a 30% chance of rain or a 90% chance of winning a bet, and we just kind of accept it as fact. But what we've been talking about today, it suggests we need to dig a little deeper.
So it's not about throwing out probability altogether. We're not saying it's useless.
No, not at all. It's still a valuable tool, but we need to use it with a more critical eye. We need to remember that it's often a blend of actual chance and our own limited knowledge, And that can really affect how we understand and use those numbers.
Okay, so how can we become more, savvy about using probabilities in our daily lives? How can we be more aware of those subjective elements that are kind of baked in?
I think it starts with asking questions. When you see a probability, any probability, don't just accept it blindly. Ask yourself, what are the assumptions behind this number? What information are they basing this on? And maybe even more importantly, how does this probability make me feel? Like, given what I know about the situation.
I like that you added that personal element, how it makes you feel. It's like our gut feeling should play a role too.
Exactly. Our intuition is actually pretty powerful when it comes to dealing with uncertainty. If a probability just doesn't sit right with you, maybe there's something you're missing. Or maybe the assumptions they're using, they don't really line up with your understanding of how things work.
So it's about finding that balance.
Right.
Not blindly trusting the numbers, but also not just ignoring them completely. We can use our own judgment and experience to help us interpret and make sense of those probabilities.
Absolutely. And the best part is, you don't need to be a math whiz to do this. Just being aware of this, that probabilities aren't always as objective as they seem, well, it can help you avoid being misled by predictions that sound way too confident, and it can help you make better decisions, in all sorts of areas of your life.
This whole deep dive, it's really changed how I think about probability. I used to see it as this fixed, objective thing, but now I see it's way more complex and even, I guess, personal than I realized.
And that's what's so cool about exploring these kinds of fundamental ideas. It really makes you question your assumptions and see things in a new light.
Yeah, totally. So to sum it all up, I think the main takeaway here is that even though probability might not exist in this pure objective way, it's still a really powerful tool for navigating a world that's full of uncertainty. By understanding its limitations and embracing that subjective side, we can all become better thinkers and make more informed decisions.
I think that's a great way to put it. And remember, next time you come across a probability, don't just take it at face value. Ask questions, trust your gut. And just remember, what's the probability that we're all wrong about this? Maybe it exists, maybe it doesn't. But the discussion itself is what makes it so interesting, right?
It definitely keeps things interesting. And on that note, we'll let you continue exploring this fascinating topic on your own. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. And until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep digging deeper into the world of ideas.